Today, I want to cover a topic that is pretty fundamental, basic doctrine of the church. We often, through the years, have gotten questions on the topic. People ask me and ask other ministers, how should I keep the Sabbath? And so today I want to give some basic principles that enable us to keep God's Sabbath as He commanded. And this is a fundamental teaching and doctrine of the church, but it's good to review it for those of us who've been here a while. And we have new people. We have several new people that have come along, and they have questions about the Sabbath. And the most common questions I'm asked about the Sabbath is, well, first of all, why do you keep it? When do you keep it? But how do you keep it is probably the most asked questions. First of all, let's go to Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Mark chapter 2. And verse 27. A very simple concept, but a very important concept. And he said to them, Christ said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. What a basic fundamental idea. But God created the Sabbath for man. And he said it doesn't work the other way around. I didn't make man for the Sabbath, but I made the Sabbath for man. God knew that we would need a break every 7 days, that we needed some refreshment spiritually and physically. We needed that time off. When was the Sabbath made? Like, how far back does this go? We go all the way back to Genesis. Go to Genesis 2. This is why when we get to Exodus chapter 20 and we read the Ten Commandments and God talks about the Sabbath, he said, remember. It's like you can't remember something you didn't know before, right? The Sabbath was instituted from the very beginning in creation week. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. And then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. And it's interesting that God rested, he led by example, and that he instituted the keeping of the Sabbath right from the beginning. So Adam knew about the Sabbath, and of course his family knew about the Sabbath, and righteous men and women started keeping it and continued to keep it down through history. Let's go to Exodus 20. The next one is, let's go look at the Ten Commandments and see what God said here about the Sabbath. Exodus 20 will begin in verse 8. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He made it holy. Only God can make something holy, and he made it holy. This is holy time. And we'll see that, it's holy time from sunset to sunset, that entire period of time. And this was one of the actual blessings that God gave man. And if the Sabbath is properly kept, it is truly a delight. It is truly something that is a blessing and a benefit for all of us. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden for anyone, and all of God's commandments, for that matter, are that way. None of the commandments are burdensome. They're all good for me. They're good for you. They're good for our neighbors. They're good for everyone. And if mankind would just follow these basic commands or rules that God gave, it'd be a whole different planet than what we live on today. Now, throughout much of ancient Israel's history, we see that they got off track and they began to go into apostasy, and they began to slip up and not keep the Sabbath the way that God intended it. right from the beginning. And by the way, the Sabbath was kept from the time of Adam. It was kept here, it talked about in the Ten Commandments. And then Christ kept the Sabbath. We see that the apostles kept the Sabbath. We see that it was Paul's custom to keep the Sabbath. It never stopped. It was enforced from the beginning, and it's still enforced yet today. And we can easily show that and prove it. It was their custom. It was what they did. They would go into the synagogue in the days of Christ on the Sabbath day. And so this has not been done away or gotten rid of as far as God's concerned. Now, let's go to Ezekiel Exodus. Let's do Exodus 31. I'm sorry about that, Exodus 31. This is another important point with regard to the Sabbath. We'll read verses 14 through 17. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths," and here the word is plural. He's talking about the weekly Sabbaths. He's also talking about the annual Sabbaths. The holy days would be included. He said, "Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you." The Sabbath was meant to be a sign between God and his people. And one of the things that we should all know is God's people keep the Sabbath. And it's a sign of who the true church is. It's a sign of who God's people really are because they keep it. And people who don't keep the Sabbath don't fit that category. It doesn't mean that everybody that's aware that there is a Sabbath has been called and their minds open to the truth, but everyone who has had their minds open to the truth and has been called understands the Sabbath exists, that it needs to be kept, and that it is a sign between God and his people. He goes on to say, in verse 15, "Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is a Sabbath of rest, holy," notice again, "to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." So it is a very important sign between God and his people. And sometimes I've heard people who've been in the church a long time say, "Why do we regularly talk about the Sabbath? Like, we all know we need to keep it." Just remember how important it is to God. It's literally a sign between God and his people. And those who don't keep it certainly have not obeyed God's clear instructions here. Now, look at Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 12 and 13. And again, just some of these are basic scriptures on the topic. We lay a foundation here. Ezekiel 20, verses 12 and 13. And by the way, any of you in the room today should be able to explain why you keep the Sabbath, what God wants us to do or not to do on the Sabbath to somebody who asks you, whether that's at work, whether that's at school, wherever that may be. This is a fundamental doctrine and teaching that all of us should be able to answer. Even young people should be able to answer when asked. It says here in verse 12, Ezekiel 20, "Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them." Sanctifies means to set apart for a holy purpose. "Yet the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly defiled my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness and consume them." So God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And if we do not keep his Sabbaths, if we defile the Sabbath, God says, look, that makes me furious. God is not happy when we do that. God warned, for instance, the people of Jerusalem, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, in Jeremiah, that if they did not keep his Sabbaths, that he would destroy the city. And we see in Jeremiah 17, verse 27, that he gave them the warning. And we see in Jeremiah 52, We can read that whole chapter, that they broke the Sabbath, and the result was the sacking and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Chaldeans and the captivity of its citizens. So God is the same today. You know, it's interesting because it is an identifying sign between him and his people. The tribes of Israel became known as the lost 10 tribes, and the reason they became lost is they didn't keep the Sabbath. Today, the nation of Israel, which is Jews, composed of Jews, the tribe of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob was called Judah, right? He's one of the 12 sons. He's one of the 12 tribes. The Jews never lost sight of the Sabbath, and they never lost sight of who they are. They know that they're Jews. They know they're descended from Judah. They didn't have a lost identity like the other nations that failed to do what God told them to do. It's one of the reasons that, you know, we go back to this topic and other fundamental topics from time to time. Even the holy days, we talk about the meaning of those holy days as they come around every year to keep us in remembrance of these things, and so that we don't slip away or fall away from them. Now, you know, most Jews that live in Israel today are not called, but they have not lost sight of where the Sabbath is. You know, we have always had this argument that comes up, well, how do we know it's we're keeping it on the right day of the week? You know, we look back in the Old Testament and the sun, you know, the time was turned back, and, you know, they have all these clever arguments, and you really don't have to even go there. We can argue that if you want. But at the end of the day, we only have to go back 2,000 years, the days of Christ, and we can easily prove that he was keeping the seventh-day Sabbath on the same day that we're keeping it today. That's all the further we have to go, because Christ got it right. We don't have to think, well, maybe he got it wrong too. No, we just go that far. And that is very easy for anybody in this room to prove we've still got it on the right day of the week. There are people that have these world calendars. They're trying to change that. You know, Monday be the first day of the week, Sunday being the seventh. They're trying to justify the day that they worship on, which you can't by Scripture. It's very clear. It's seventh-day Sabbath. It's on the day we call, on the Romans, Saturday, right? Seventh day of the week. But it's interesting that Judah never lost its identity because they never lost sight of the Sabbath. They've kept track of that. And, you know, when we look at the New Testament, they had a duty. God gave them the duty of protecting and keeping track of and the oracles, right? So they had a duty. Their job was to, number one, keep very close attention and track of the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament, which they have done an amazing job of. I mean, to the letter. These guys, those scribes and the people that protected that, we see that down through history, people lost their lives protecting the Holy Scriptures. And when Bibles started to be printed and they wanted to get them out to people, that people died for that. But they were very, very scrupulous and very careful to preserve the Old Testament Scriptures. They also had a duty to preserve the calendar. I've had people that walked out of the church about the calendar. The church's got it wrong. We don't understand, the calendar. It's not our job to understand the calendar. It's the Jews' job. They determine it. That's what God gave them a job to do, and they've done a perfect job of it. I remember when I was at Ambassador College, we had a professor there that you could literally give him when is Pentecost or when is trumpets in 2064, and he would get the blackboard out and calculate it for you. It can be done. People who know how to do it, it can certainly calculate the days. But it's a Jew's job, and they've done it remarkably well. And they also were to keep track of the weekly cycle, which they've done. Now, are they doing all the other things God said? No, not so much. But it's interesting. Right now, we're looking at the war that's happening over there in the Middle East. The enemies are all around the Jews. The Sabbath has been an issue for God's people down through history. People have been killed and tortured for keeping the Sabbath. They've been declared anathema to Christ because you're going to quit keeping that Sabbath. You're going to work on Saturday. You're going to rest on Sunday. This is going to rear its ugly head once again before Christ returns. Now, when we look at the Sabbath, again, we see that ancient Israel would keep it for a while, and then they'd get off track, and we'd see they'd end up back in captivity. God would pull all the blessings away, and then they would cry out to God, and He'd deliver them. And often they'd get back on track for a period of time, but it was a cycle that happened with them. Remember, the ancient Israelites were unconverted. They did not have God's Spirit. And so they actually acted pretty carnal back in the day. But the ones who sought to obey God were blessed for doing so. We have God's Spirit. We're without excuse. We know better. We all have Bibles. We all know what God says. We've all been taught. And so God expects us to really lead the pack here, to lead by example. Now, we see that after Jerusalem was sacked by the Chaldeans and they went into captivity, a number of years later, as we read the story in the Old Testament, the people rebuilt the city. They acknowledged the Sabbath once again, and many began to talk about it. And we see Nehemiah, in his inspired message in the Old Testament, was contending with the nobles of Judah. And notice what he said in Nehemiah 13, verse 17. Ezra and Nehemiah. All right, Nehemiah 13, 17. And I think we'll read, let's read verse 18 as well. It says, "Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." And again, these guys were doing regular business. They were, trading and buying and selling. It became defiled. Again, they weren't doing what God told them to do. Nehemiah contends with him. And upon receiving Nehemiah's correction, we see that a number of the people, in fact, most of the people repented. And they started observing the Sabbath again. But human nature, as it is, right, it usually goes from one ditch to the other, from one extreme to the other. And that's exactly what happened. After the death of Nehemiah, we see a number of religious zealots, the Pharisees in particular, which was the leading religious party of the time, began to add a whole bunch of do's and don'ts to the keeping of the Sabbath. In their minds, God's law and what God said wasn't good enough. The people don't have enough knowledge and understanding and wisdom like we do, and therefore we have to legislate in minute detail what people can do or not do on the Sabbath. And they did just that. For instance, they established 39 categories of prohibited work on the Sabbath. When I lived with the family and I lived out in Maryland, we lived about 13 or 14 miles from the White House, but we were just out on the Maryland side in a heavily Jewish community. And in that community, it was kind of a perk because every time there was a holy day, the kids had the day off school, which was kind of nice. But anyway, they, of course, not for the Feast of Tabernacles. They just keep going. But in that community, if you were to go to any elevator in any building on the Sabbath, it was on Sabbath mode, which means it stopped at every floor because the Jews thought they were breaking the Sabbath to press the button. That was work. So it's got Sabbath mode, and it stops every floor up and every floor down. Joette worked with some people, and one of the lady's sons was in a drama club or an acting class or something like that. And it was a Friday night production. It was after sunset. This person believed, like many, you have to get near the synagogue before sunset, and then you can only travel, a Sabbath day's journey on foot, a short distance, about 2/3 of a mile each way. If anything more than that would be breaking the Sabbath. But her kid was going to perform in the high school drama club play after sundown. And Joe's like, how does that work? oh, well, he's not going to put on his own makeup or clothes. Somebody else will do that, so it's okay. So the rules are extensive, and then you have to get permission to do this or that or the other. Well, that you can do. As long as you don't do this, you can do that. And it became their own religion. And the Pharisees in the day of Christ were just like that. And they constantly accused Christ himself and the disciples of breaking the Sabbath. Christ would heal somebody. Oh, you broke the Sabbath. You healed them on the Sabbath. And yet they would gladly take their ox out of the ditch so it wouldn't die, because that would cost some money. We'll save the animal, but it's a human. No, that's work, and you shouldn't be doing that on the Sabbath. The people would be out, Christ and the disciples, they pick a little corn or grain as they're walking through a field and they're eating it. Oh, they're harvesting, they're breaking the Sabbath. They added all these do's and don'ts, and they made the Sabbath a burden, which it was never, ever meant to be. Their motives may have been good in the beginning. Their objectives might have been good, but the rabbis, by their strict legislation, made the Sabbath not a blessing anymore, but a burden. And we have to have balance in the church. Sometimes we get in one ditch or another. I think the trend in the days in which we live is to be too liberal and to do too many things we shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath. But growing up in the church, I knew some were super strict, and like you're not able to do anything. Most of those kids left the church. They're not with us anymore. That wasn't balanced if families did that. Our family did not do that. I think Mom and Dad had a balanced approach, and we grew up in the church and loved the Sabbath. It was a tremendous blessing. Now, let's look at some keys to Sabbath keeping. First of all, God is really concerned with two main things, two overall aspects, we might say, of our life on the Sabbath. Number one, he wants our time to be free from responsibilities and activities that we normally do all week long. And we'll talk more in detail about this. And number two, secondly, he wants our mind to be free from thinking about those daily responsibilities and those activities. And that allows us to properly worship God on the Sabbath. How do we do that? How do we practically apply that information? Because we are to serve God with our mind on the Sabbath. Those who can't control their minds on the Sabbath, frankly, you're not going to enjoy the Sabbath for the blessing it was intended to be. If you're in business, you have to learn to shut it off for 24 hours. You're not in business for 24 hours. You're not going to think about it. You're not going to worry about it. You're not going to worry about the bills. You're not going to worry about the other contractors. That is gone for 20. This is holy time, and I'm just going to shut that off. I can't do anything about it anyway. God commands me to rest. Like, what a burden, right? I got to rest. I can't work. No, that's really a tremendous blessing. This is one we all should keep. I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to keep it, because it's so good. I mean, hey, I have to shut it off. Like, God didn't even let me work. No, you got to rest. Okay, your mind should be free of that. And once you learn to think that way and act that way, now, even when I was in business, had my own business as a carpenter, a trim carpentry business. None of my guys worked on the Sabbath. I didn't work on the Sabbath, and I didn't take calls on the Sabbath. And when I started my business, I got a lot of calls on the Sabbath. But when I never called anybody back till the sunset, they quit calling me on the Sabbath, because they knew I'm never going to pick that phone up. And some guys would even get mad at me. I said, I told you, that's my Sabbath. You can call 10 times. I'm not picking the phone up. This is my day off. If it's some serious emergency, just pretend I'm dead and get somebody else to handle it. I don't need to do it. It will be okay. Now, if you are the boss and it is an emergency, that's different. You can deal with it. The ox in the ditch, God allows for it. But my point is, get it out of your mind. Don't think about it. And kids, that applies to you. You shouldn't be doing homework at church. You shouldn't be doing what you do all week long. You got the day off, man. I never let my kids grow up in church to do homework at the feast. Like, we're going to the feast. You work real hard up to the feast. You work real hard after the feast. But guess what? It's feast. Shut it off. Let's go. Let's have fun. We got this time. Let's enjoy it to the fullest. But on the Sabbath and the high days, it should not happen. And once you start to do it right, you go, man, this is awesome. This is great. This is really a rest. we've through the years had people that can't wait for the Sabbath to be over. They're timing it. Like, okay, now I can go. I can go do what I've been wanting to do. God doesn't really want us to think that way. Just eagerly anticipate the setting of the sun so we can go right back to what we've been doing the other 6 days. Now, there's balance in that, right? If you're a young kid and you've been resting all day Sabbath, and we're at camp, we're going to have a dance, or we're going to do something fun. Like you've had all this pent-up energy, let's go burn it off. Let's go have some fun. There's nothing wrong with that. But to just like dread the Sabbath and just count the minutes, I can't wait till this is over, is just the wrong kind of thinking. We've got to learn to get our minds and our thoughts on what is God's purpose for us, what are his ways. The Sabbath should be a delight, and we should be able to talk primarily about the things of God. We can talk about prophecy, look what's happening in the world, talk about, hey, the feast is coming up, or hey, I can't wait till we go out to the family weekend, we all get to spend time, or camp, or like it's positive, it's the things of God, it's stuff that we're not going to just sit here and go over all of our architectural plans for our new house with somebody else on the Sabbath. Like, I can talk about my house for a few minutes. Like, that's balance in all this. I can ask you, how was your week? And it's not spiritual. Balance. But predominantly, the discussions and the conversation should really be more on the things of God than what we talk about all week long. And so we have to get our minds and thoughts onto God and his way of life. And how do we accomplish that? Well, first of all, on the Sabbath, because your time is free of all the regular stuff, you have more time to sit down and actually read your Bible. You could spend more time in prayer. You could take extra time to think about or meditate about things of importance. I know this through the years in my life in the church, my best friends were always in the church. And maybe that's because I had way more in common with them. But we always talked about, and we still do. I have friends I still call across the country, and we talk about, end time events, and we can't wait for the kingdom to come. And our conversation predominantly ends up, even if it's during the week and I'm visiting them down in Florida or somewhere else, our conversation is mainly on the things of God. It's just what we're thinking about. It's the most important stuff in our life. And obviously during the week you have businesses to run, you have all the other stuff you got to do, but the Sabbath gives you that extra time, free time, to dwell on the things you may not have as much time for during the week. I know when I was working in construction, I'm working long hours and I was working a second job. I'm not going to sit down and read my Bible for an hour a day. It just didn't happen. I try to maybe sometimes it was a chapter and think about it and say my prayers. But, other days I had more time, and on the Sabbath I always had more time. It was about balancing everything and saying, look, I'm going to make a habit out of prayer every day. I'm going to make a habit out of studying every day. But realistically, you're not, I'm a minister. I have more time to study now. It's part of my job. Like, I have to write a sermon. I have to write Bible studies. I got to get the job done so I can talk about it. That's what I'm doing. So, of course, I have more time to put in it. But, even my job, there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of emails. There's a lot of, planning, physical planning for feast sites and camps and things too. So it's, Paul was building tents and he was doing his job. I'm not building tents, but I got other stuff going on too. It's just the way it is. But on the Sabbath, again, take more time for those things. You don't have to worry about the job. You don't have to worry about making your house payment. You don't have to worry about, man, I got to build that fence in the backyard, or I got this honeydew list. Man, I got a bunch stacking up on there. Just shut that off. We can't do it today anyway. Think about that tomorrow. Look at God's instructions, and these are really positive instructions about the Sabbath in Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah 58. Verse 13 and 14. And this is interesting. Notice what God says here. He says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, not finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. So he really hit some important keys here about keeping the Sabbath properly. First of all, he points out that it's important for us in really three aspects here. If you look at it closely at those verses, he says, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Three important points about Sabbath keeping here. And it's something we don't want to overlook because it's very important. What are our ways? Okay, this really is talking about our employment. It's talking about our enterprises, our finances, the serious business of making a livelihood. We shouldn't involve ourselves in working in what we normally do during the week on the Sabbath. And that can include things like, working around the house, sewing, washing the car, mowing the grass. That's stuff that can be done 6 days a week, not on the Sabbath. So don't do your own ways. He says, don't do your own pleasure. In other words, forsake your own pleasure on the Sabbath. Does that mean the Sabbath's like this rigorous day of abstinence? You can't have any fun. You can't enjoy it? No, God never intended it to be that way. But the Sabbath's not designed for things like, I'm going to go hunting today, or I'm going to go on a fishing trip, or I'm heading to the movies this afternoon, or, I'm turning on the football game. I'm going to watch that, this big game. It's Saturday games. That's not what the Sabbath is for. You then are doing your own pleasure. And God says, no, you got to forsake that. Don't do that. Shut that stuff off. You can check the game scores when the sun sets. Or, nowadays you can just watch it when the sun sets, right? Because you can record it, or it's pre-recorded. It didn't always used to be that way. It's like, I'm missing my favorite show. Well, yeah, you missed it. It's the way it goes. And then third, he says your own words. So this is kind of the spiritual application of the first two principles. Matthew 12:34 says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So, what you're thinking about and what you're dwelling on comes out of your mouth. And on the Sabbath, that should be different than, what we're thinking about. And what we're talking about should be different than what it is during the week. And that takes a little practice. I know when people first come in the church, they're consumed with, I should be doing this. I'm not doing that. It doesn't take long, though. You should get like, look, I can't do it anyway. Let's shut it off. Let's go. Let's enjoy this. And it changes. It just totally changes the blessing that God gives us when we get to that point. Again, I will stress, don't be Pharisaical in either ditch. Some people he came up and asked me how my week was, or I got a new car and he asked me what kind it was. It's Sabbath. We'll talk about that during the week. Balance. Come on, let's be normal here. We can ask those questions too. It's just not primarily what we're going to just consume our conversations with every time we get around people to fellowship on the Sabbath or on a high day for that matter. Now, in the world, people go like, when do I start keeping the Sabbath? We all know the answer to this. We have to know when the Sabbath starts and when it ends in order to keep it properly. If you were to explain to somebody why we keep it, when we keep it, what would you tell them? First thing you could do is go back to Genesis. We'll go to chapter 1. And if we look at verse 5, for instance, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening, notice the evening and the morning were the first day. And if you look at verse 8, in the evening and the morning, right, whatever day it is, verse 13, verse 19, the evening and the morning. So the way that God looks at time is different than the way man looks at time. It starts at sunset. The day begins in the evening. It starts at sunset, and it ends 24 hours later at sunset. Leviticus 23, let's go there, helps to clear this up. Again, here a little, there a little. Look at all the scriptures, but Leviticus 23, verse 32. And that's an easy one to remember. 23, just reverse it, 32. And Leviticus 23, by the way, it contains information about the Sabbath and then all the holy days in one chapter. So if you can remember Leviticus 23, you can always find some information here about a holy day or a Sabbath. But here, notice what he says in Leviticus 23, verse 32. He says, "It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls." He's in particular talking about an annual Sabbath here, the Day of Atonement. "The 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath." So the Sabbath, this is a high day Sabbath, but again, it's from evening to evening or sunset to sunset. The Jews understand this, right? They know when the day starts. We know, members of the church know when the day starts. If you look at any basic calendar, you see, right, Saturday is the 7th day of the week. So therefore, Friday night at sunset is when the Sabbath starts, and it ends Saturday night when the sun sets. If you don't have the ability to have a phone or a computer and you're hiking in the mountains, when the sun sets behind the horizon, it is now sunset and the day starts. So even people all through time back to Adam could just simply look in the sky. Oh, the sun just dropped behind the horizon. We're into the Sabbath now. And, you know, it's something that anybody today can readily find, like to the minute. You could probably find to the second when it begins. But that's when the Sabbath begins and ends, and that's, according to God, holy time. Another important aspect about the Sabbath is the preparation for the Sabbath. And people don't always think about that. Look at Exodus 16, verse 23. God wants us to prepare in advance for the Sabbath. The Sabbath doesn't start till sunset. But like anything, if you're taking a trip or you have plans to do anything in life, you make preparations for it. This is no different. In Exodus 16, beginning in verse 23, it says, "Then the Lord said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until the morning." So we see here that all the heavy cooking and, the roasting and boiling, the heavy lifting was done on the preparation day. And today, practically speaking, it'd be like you're making a potato salad, right? You got to boil potatoes and peel them. You got to boil the eggs and peel them. You got to put all the components together. It takes some time. It becomes a task. Why not knock that out on Friday? Throw it in the refrigerator. It's nice and chilled and ready to go for Saturday. If you're going to do a roast, get it all ready. Throw it in the crock pot. All you got to do is turn it on. The things that you can do in advance. It's not, I'm going to bake for 4 hours. It's Saturday. Now, balance. You don't have to do your eggs on Friday and just hopefully you can heat them up and they're okay on Saturday. Or throw something in a skillet, or throw some rolls in the oven. None of that is a lot of work and a lot of effort. God makes an allowance for that on all the holy days, which are high days, except for atonement. You have to prepare food. God goes, I know that. It's going to take a little work to do that. But again, do what you can do at a time so that it's not eating up 3 hours of your Sabbath doing meal preparation when that could be done 6 days during the week. I know that for us growing up in the church, our best meals were on Sabbath. Friday night was the best of the week. Mom prepared in advance, and it was the Sabbath is a feast day. Doesn't mean we can't fast on it, but it is traditionally and according to God a feast day. Go back to Leviticus 23. And again, it's a feast day both spiritually and physically. But they go hand in hand, the physical and the spiritual. Some people just want to throw the physical stuff out the door. And again, it doesn't mean we can't ever fast on a Sabbath, because we know Christ fasted for 40 days, which would have included several Sabbaths. Moses did that. We see others fasting on Sabbath. It's almost, I think of an ox in a ditch, that's a special thing. But yeah, it's okay to fast on a Sabbath. But traditionally and according to God, this is a feast day. He says in verse 1, and it's entitled The Feast of the Lord. That's not inspired, but it's the heading. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, The feasts of the Lord which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And it's considered a feast day like the others. And again, atonement is a day we fast. We're not feasting. But traditionally, it's when we had our best meals. Mom and Dad, Mom would get the candles out, or, get the flowers picked. We have flowers Friday night. It was a beautiful meal. Sabbath had a nice brunch. It was a special time for us growing up in the church, and we look forward to it. We weren't like, oh no, here comes the Sabbath. This is going to be, we got to sit still and not do anything. That's not the way it was, and I don't think it should be the way that God intends it to be done. We see in the Old Testament, for instance, the Israelites were not to gather manna on a Sabbath. The Israelites are not to go get wood for their fire on the Sabbath. And people go, well, if I'm camping, can I have a campfire? Yes. Let's think about why God said what he said. So the Israelites, 600 men, right? Could have been around 3 million people, women and children. That's what estimates are. That's a lot of people. And if we're camping and we're not moving for a few days, you're going to go a long ways to find firewood, because that's a lot of people and all the wood's gone. I've been at campsites where it's picked clean. I'm getting there, in the fall to camp out, and you can't find any dead wood. Like, everybody's got it and burned it. And it was that way with 3 million people. You might have to go miles to get wood to start your fire and cook on. So God goes, no, don't go looking for wood on the Sabbath. You do that on Friday, lay it up in a pile, and then you can do your cooking. You got it right there. He told them not to go get the manna on the Sabbath. So number one, he got them right back in touch with, this is the Sabbath. There's no question. This is the seventh day. This is the Sabbath. I'm getting you in line with time. But you're not going to go out and gather manna. Again, this might be some effort, take some time. You gather a double portion on Friday, and you keep it over on Saturday, and you can cook it and eat it, or whatever you do. It'll be not a lot of work. And if they'd done that any other day of the week, we see that it stank. It got full of worms, but God performed the miracle. And again, he demonstrates by that and other things that his intention was, let's not work a lot on the Sabbath. Let's prepare and lay up for it. And it's a good principle for us yet today. Let's look at another important aspect of the Sabbath. Let's see, I've got several here. I added a bunch this morning, but let's go to this one. Let's talk a little bit about the ox in the ditch. This is an important aspect of Sabbath keeping. Let's go to Mark chapter 3 and verse 4. And mention this first of all before we get to the verse on the ox in the ditch. But Mark 3 and verse 4. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or not, or to do evil, to save life or to kill? And they kept silent. So again, when Christ healed people on the Sabbath, the critics accused him of working and doing something wrong. And yet Christ said, well, look, if you could rescue your ox that fell in a ditch. And if you know anything about an ox, when it falls in a ditch, if it's muddy and it can't get out, it will struggle until it dies to get out of there. And God says, no, spare the life of the ox. Go put a rope around it. It's going to be some hard work. Get your neighbors and drag that thing out of the ditch and save its life. It's the Sabbath. That's going to take a little effort, but that's an ox in a ditch. That's an emergency. Go do it. Save the life. The life's more important than the work you're going to have to do to save the life. And so, his rebuttal to them about healing somebody on the Sabbath is, look, you'll go pull your ox out of the ditch, but you're not going to let me heal this guy? What's wrong with you guys? Of course, this is not a wrong thing to do. Luke chapter 14 talks about the ox in the ditch. Let's look at that. You're like saying, hey, well, I don't have any oxen, so how does that apply to me, right? Luke 14, verse 1. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely, and behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And they kept silent. And he took him and healed him and let him go. And then he answered them, saying, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Of course they would. That would cost them some money. We can't lose the animal. In the Church of God, emergencies, we would say, are oxes in a ditch. Your water main breaks. I can't shut the water main off. Like, it's a turn. Shut the water main off. Don't flood your house for 18 more hours waiting for sunset. Common sense should kick in. This is an emergency. A tornado hit, right? Or you're on the way to church and you're in an accident. Well, this is going to have to be a hit and run. I got to get to church. No, stay and fill out the paperwork. You might even miss church. It's an emergency. It's an ox in the ditch. And so the thing we've always told members of the church is don't push the ox in the ditch. Like, don't cause this, right? Like, come on, you're doing this so that you can break the Sabbath and you justify it in your mind. Don't push the ox in the ditch. And there are some emergencies, quote unquote, that can wait till sundown. They can wait. It's an emergency, but it's not a pressing emergency. It's not life and death, and you can get to it. You know, I know. Even working in trades, sometimes that job has to be done. They're moving in on Sunday. You've got to have it done today. Yeah, well, when the sun sets, I'll be there and I'll work all night. But I don't have to do that on the Sabbath. I can wait till that sun goes down and then jump in there, and I still get you in to your offices on time Sunday morning. So again, do what you can to alleviate the oxes in the ditch, right? To not have to do those things on the Sabbath. We also saw in Leviticus 23, verse 2, that the Sabbath is a holy convocation. What does it mean to convoke? It means to assemble. We could say commanded assembly. Who commanded us to assemble? God did. So is Sabbath, assembling on the Sabbath, optional? Not according to God, it's not. When we first moved into the church, we had 178 miles each way to church, and I don't ever remember us missing a Sabbath. We always got there. Summer, winter, snow, and we had a 54 Ford, and we lived in North Dakota, and went to Saskatchewan and up into Canada for church because that was the closest one. We'd have to make that border crossing by 9 p.m. or that shut down until morning. That was a challenge, and I've got plenty of stories about trying to make that border crossing and other stories during the year, but it was important to get there. We got there. Now, I realize we have scattered brethren that can't get, like we have people in Montana. There's no church anywhere forever. We have people in Washington State. They get down sometimes to Reno for the holy days, but that's 11 hours each way. That's pretty impressive, man. That's putting effort in. The point is, we are scattered, and I realize not everybody can be here, but those who can should be, because God says you should be. He commands your assembling, and it's interesting when you get to Hebrews 10, what God said here. And, we always should be concerned about what does God think? What does he say? When people say, well, I can't keep the feast, I'm like, okay, what's God going to do to people in the millennium, Zechariah 14, if they don't keep the feast? No rain for those people. Or he's going to pour out a plague on these people. Guess what? They're going to start listening and keeping the feast. He's the same God today. He wants you at the feast. He wants you to be here if you can be here. He says so. I'm not saying this. He is. So, again, sickness would prohibit that. Occasional emergencies or circumstances will prohibit it. We understand that. God understands that. But in Hebrew 10, this verse is so important. I mean, we are Church of God assembly, right? And this is one of the reasons that we called it that. Hebrews 10, we'll start here in verse 24. He says, verse 23, we'll start. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another to stir up love and good works. Notice, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another. And he says, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Which day? The return of Christ. The day Christ is coming back, the end of the age. It's more important than ever to assemble and not forsake that. And people just read right over it. And I didn't write this. I'm just telling you what it says, and I know God meant it. And our actions have to prove our dedication. And that's in every area. If we say we have faith and we preach about faith, which we've done a lot, God just might test us on faith. And then are we going to follow through and do it? We talk a talk. Now are we going to follow through and actually have faith and demonstrate that by our actions? God wants to see that. So the Sabbath, again, is important to God. And it's so important. Look at Exodus 34:21. People go, well, what if I've got to get my corn crop in, I got to harvest it, or I got to get this, soybeans in the ground. I got a good day. It's going to rain all week. I have to do it now. Surely that would be an ox in the ditch. It's my livelihood. If I don't get it in, I might not have a crop, and we're going to, not have any money. Well, Exodus 34 and verse 21. Exodus 34, verse 21. It says, 6 days shall you work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest time you shall rest. He goes, nah, you don't get a break. I know you got to get the crops in. I know you got to get them harvested, but Sabbath, shut it down. This is not an option. It shows you how serious God is about this command. And it is a sign between him and his people. And it, one of the big things, like I said, in history, was the Catholic Church enforcing people to keep Sunday instead of Saturday and work on the Sabbath and rest on Sunday. And people were persecuted, they were tortured, they were killed because they would not comply. And who knows, if we knew today there was a good chance they were going to come in here and arrest us and haul us off to jail because we're assembling on the Sabbath, how many people would be here? I'm going to be here. I hope you're going to be here. Like, we got to be here. Like, come get us. We're doing what God said, and God will have to, get us through it. We have to do the right thing. Doesn't matter what it costs us. It doesn't matter how tough it gets. God said, I got to do it. He did it for a reason. It's a real blessing. I want to do it. I'm not even doing it because I have to. I want to do it anymore. I want to keep the holy days. I want to keep the Sabbath. I love getting together with God's people and visiting. We're up late last night. Like, every time we get together, we only have this limited time so we don't sleep. Our eyes get redder, and then we go home and we catch up a little bit, and then we go do it again. But it's because we love being together, and we love assembling, and we love fellowshipping, and that's what God loves. He likes to see that. This is a day of rest and refreshing. It's also a day that we can fellowship with other people of like mind. And God says that's important. In Malachi, God talks about those that spoke often to one another are the people that are going to make up the jewels in his future kingdom. Like, he loves the fact that we're together, that we fellowship. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Like, I know some people are hard to get along with. I get that. Maybe I'm hard to get along with some people, but you know what? You got to love me anyway because God called me, and I'll try to be, reciprocate that love. But we got to try to work through the differences, and there has to be peace and unity and fellowship and pulling together, edification. We see Paul write all about edification over and over again. And he lived at a time where there was contention and strife and negativity. We live at a time like that now. The amount of negativity that I get in my emails and stuff is off the chart sometimes. But I'm not going to let that get me down. I'll acknowledge it. I'll take a look at it, and then we'll address what we can. And the rest of it goes in the hate file. And we just keep going. We're going to stay positive. We got to work through things. We got to work past problems. None of us are in the category of Moses, who was so patient with those Israelites. I'm like, man, that guy, I wish I was more like that. That guy was awesome. Like, he put up with a lot of garbage. They wanted to stone him, kill him. Who made you our leader? We're going to get our own leader. And Moses, oh boy, here we go again, and he just kept going. And I admire that about him. And we're small. It's not even compared to millions of people, 3 million people, but it's a great example, and we all got to be that way. And realize that God's alive, God's well, he's watching this whole thing. This is all temporary. God is evaluating us right now, and the kingdoms are right around the corner. Look at the world, man. We do not have much time left. I mean, we can look at this from any angle that we want to. 6,000 years of human history we're at the end of it. We look at 19-year time cycles. When's the next one? We look at, Mr. Armstrong died in 86, 40 years. 40 is a big number. Testing, right, in the wilderness, that'd be 2026. Maybe that's significant, maybe not. But any way you look at this, everything converges to the next, decade or so. It could be way more imminent than that. But when people say we got 40, 50 years left, you're out of your mind. We don't. It is upon us. We're on the home stretch. We're not going to set dates. I'm not going to set a date because I don't know. And I'm not going to say 5 to 7 years, 5 to 7 years for 30 years. We're just going to say it's imminent. Pay attention. Get your house in order. Christ's going to be back here soon. And pray for that. Thy kingdom come, right? Thy will be done on earth as it's already happening up there in heaven at the throne of God. We need that. I'm driving over here today. Man, beautiful church, big yard. I'm like, could we just have a little headquarters building with like a little grass and a meeting room, for the brethren, like a house to worship God in, and maybe some sheetrock walls for offices. That's all we need. That'd be kind of cool. And we're actually working toward that. We might be doing that before too long. But the bottom line is we need the kingdom. All the churches will be God's churches. We don't have to drive to church. We just walk to it. It's down the street. And there'll be quality, and it'll be wonderful when that day comes. But we've got a little hard stuff to get through to get there. So let's just pray that the kingdom comes. Let's rock through the hard stuff and get to the good stuff. The best is yet to come. That's the good news of the coming kingdom. That's the whole gospel message. Focus on that, and you can get through the hard stuff getting there. But the Sabbath is something, again, that we will be tested on. Most people in the church get tested on the Sabbath with time off for work. Sometimes it's a test that you're supposed to take this SAT or other tests on a Sabbath. Nope, can't do it. My kids, when they did hunter safety, well, the only classes are on Saturday. I'm like, well, we'll just have to find a way around it. How many kids do I need for you to teach a class that's not on Saturday? Well, if you can get 8, good. We'll go get 8 people. We'll have a class on Sunday. Like, there's always a way around. And if there's not, well, then I guess you have to wait to the millennium for that one. Like, we couldn't get around it. You're not going to play professional sports. I'm sorry, because of the Sabbath. You're not going to play for the National Football League or baseball professional teams because the Sabbath's going to prohibit that. So, okay, is that the most important thing? No. You can go as far as you can go. Some people in the church have gone extremely far and done really well, and they did not compromise with right and wrong. I admire those people that stuck their guns and were good enough to make the team and participate or get in the tournament, even though they miss Sabbath performances or competitions on the way there. God loves that you just stick your guns and you do the right thing regardless. Let's look at a couple other quick aspects here that I jotted down. What about the actual Sabbath service itself, assembling on the Sabbath? Some important things here. One of the things we all do on the Sabbath that we don't, we really don't participate here at church services except that we all get to sing. Verbally, right? We're not all talking during church. This ain't a Pentecostal church and all that stuff. You're in the audience, right? You hear people lead songs or give prayers or speak. But song service, we're all part of that. Song service is a really important part of what we're here to do. Look at Psalm 95, verses 1 and 2. I'm just going to look at 2. There are dozens. When COVID hit and we weren't allowed to sing, I'm like, wait a minute, this ain't right. Let's go look at these verses, and there are dozens. It's not, and in the Psalms alone, there are dozens. And we used to have articles that said it, and the articles disappeared miraculously because nobody wanted to know they existed, but they were there. And notice what God says. The most important thing is, what does God say about singing praises to Him? Psalm 95, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence," which we do here on the Sabbath, "with thanksgiving, and let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." Somebody tells you you can't go to church and sing. I'm say, well, who are you to tell me I can't go to church and sing? God tells me I should go to church and sing. And I also know you're basing this on one stupid study that's faulty anyway. Like, what are we doing? We're going to sing. Like, I'm a pastor. My congregations are singing, and yeah, we're not going to stop singing because we're commanded to sing. Go to Psalm 100. And there were other guys who stood their ground on this. Not a lot, but some. "Make a joyful shout to the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing." We come before God's presence on the Sabbath, and we always have told people, I grew up in this. I've been here since I'm 7. I'm 60, almost 61. And we always said, dress up. Put your coat on, put your tie on, put on some nice clothes. If you're a woman, put on a nice dress or skirt, because we're coming in the presence of God. You don't walk in to see the President of the United States with your flip-flops and a muscle shirt on. Like, that doesn't happen. You got to. That's the President. That's nothing compared to God. We're coming in God's presence. We go, let's step it up. Let's comb our hair. Let's, take a shower. Hadn't done that in a while. We're coming before the presence of our Maker, and we should come here appropriately. And we come before him and we sing, and we should participate wholeheartedly. And today that happened. I mean, this is like a choir here. There's a lot of good voices. I'm like, yeah, we need to record some of these people. It was beautiful, and everybody's wholeheartedly, collectively raising their voices in honor of Almighty God. And it's a beautiful thing. I love to see our young people are fully invested, and they sing, and they put their heart into it. Some of them do special music. Some of them, like, yeah, I'm not there, but I can sing at church. Or I can back up the feast song leader. I'll jump up on the stage and do that. And they're putting their hearts into it. And we should teach our children, even when they're little, to stand and participate in the song service. And it's good for them to learn to do that. I just mentioned dress. We have parables in the Bible where you think of the people who came to the marriage. One of the parables, right? Christ is the king symbolically in the parable, and somebody wasn't dressed right and they got kicked out. They got expelled from the wedding. You're like, you're not dressed properly. Obviously, the spiritual lesson is more important than the physical, but the physical applies as well, right? Spiritually, look, if you're not properly clothed with righteousness, you're not going to make it. You think of how God operates, though. He knows we're human. He says, go put the physical leaven off your property, out of your cars, your houses, get it off. It represents sin, and we do that physical thing. Now, what's more important? The spiritual lesson, right? Put sin out of your lives. That's what that pictures. We go to the feast, God says, get a temporary dwelling. Why? Well, do we literally get a temporary dwelling? Yes. We don't stay in our house at the feast because God said not to. The Jews who stayed in their own home, what did they do? They built this lean-to shelter up on the flat roof and moved out of the house and lived in a temporary dwelling on their rooftop. People came in from out of town. They built these temporary shelters and lived in it. Why does God want us to build or to live in a temporary dwelling? Because he's teaching us this life's temporary. This isn't all there is. You are pilgrims and strangers. You're just passing through. Keep in mind the kingdom and what lies ahead, and keep your focus on that. Because if you don't, you're not going to make it. So keep your focus on that. The good news of the coming kingdom, the gospel message. Christ is coming. Good times lie ahead. The best is yet to come. Think that way. This is temporary. And guess what? You can get through hard things. Laura and Ryan going through the loss of a baby. That's a hard thing. But you know how you get through that? You focus on the future. Christ is going to be the king. Eventually God the Father is going to come down and make his throne on the earth. New heavens, new earth. Man, there's a lot of great stuff coming. And I want to be there. My mom and dad are dead. My sister died. This has all happened, recently, really. I'm going to see him soon, hopefully, right? The kingdom's not that far away. But I could be like Paul and become a castaway, not make it if I don't keep my focus, right? Anybody can fall away. We got to get it together, get your focus right. Time's short. You're not going to be able to say, nobody told me. Yeah, we told you. and we'll keep telling you. And when you're up here, other guys, they'll tell you, get ready. Guys, this is getting short now. This is important. Focus. Spiritually, we've got to be clothed properly, right? And otherwise we're out. We get expelled. But even here, we tell men who are up here, put a coat, tie, and a dress shirt on. Don't come up here to do a prayer or anything improperly dressed. When the auditorium was open, and by the way, that was a house dedicated to the great God, Ambassador Auditorium. It was a meeting hall for Sabbath services. It served many other purposes. And I love that the focus was on the brethren and a place to meet. All the offices, they were in the next building, Hall of Administration and other places. And it was beautiful too, but it was nothing like the auditorium. And we met with the ministers. I said, look, if we build a little headquarters building, that meeting room's going to be epic. Where we have offices, that just can be sheetrock and some windows. I don't care about that. We just got to work there. But we meet and sing to God. That part has to be beautiful, because that's the house for God. And I think that has to be our focus in how we act, we conduct ourselves, in the way we dress, even when we come to church. How do we benefit from Sabbath services? I think, number one, God says, conduct yourself in an orderly fashion. We've got an order of service. And we've always told people, look, there shouldn't be unnecessary talking all through church, passing notes, young people, laughing and giggling and sending notes up and down the aisle. That shouldn't happen. We should try to be good listeners. I grew up, mom and dad, like when I got a little bigger, you're taking notes. On the way home, we had a long ways to drive. Okay, tell us what your notes were. You pull your notebook out. Let me see that notebook. Oh, that's blank today. You're in trouble when we get home. Like, you didn't take notes. But we got in the habit of taking notes. And honestly, I think it's a great, notes can improve how we listen. It helps put it in our brain. I think that's why God told the kings in ancient Israel to write the law out. He said, take the book of the law, take the laws and write them out and keep it by your bed, keep it near you. Then not only have you read it, right, you've written it. Like, it helps keep it in your mind and impress it. And so taking notes is good. And children and teenagers can understand what's being said. They are sanctified. 1 Corinthians 7:14 says they're set apart, they're sanctified. Therefore, they can understand these spiritual principles which their friends at school can't get. They're not sanctified. They're set apart for a holy use or purpose, and that's why we have Bible class at camp. Like, if they're not baptized, why, and they don't get it, what are we doing having Bible class or Christian living class at camp? It'd be pointless for all the kids. But no, they do get it. And sometimes they get it better than some of the adults get it, which is awesome. Like, they're paying attention. And we want our kids to be that way. You're not here, especially as they get a little older, it's not playing games and goofing off. I mean, when they're little, obviously they're not taking notes. They're not that big. I know Joette and my mother and others, when we were little, they trained us to take naps the same time church was. So, like, we'd come to church to take a nap. Well, I didn't. I was 7, but my brother and sisters, when they were little, did. And if they played, it was with quiet toys on a blanket or something. But it wasn't just chaos. It wasn't kids running around like, Animal Farm. It was organized. It was kids, and kids are going to cry. They're going to do things wrong. They're kids. All of us understand that. We all had them. We all been a kid. I was probably one of the worst kids growing up, right? I got in trouble all the time. But I, Dad say, don't go down by the river. Where do we go? Down by the river. And guess what? Somebody falls in the river, and we don't have a change of clothes. So when we come back, like, why is he wet from the waist down and full of mud? Like, you guys went to the river. Yeah, yes, sir. Oh, you're getting it when you get home. That kind of stuff. Well, after you do that just one time, you don't do it again. It wasn't worth it. But, kids, they can be behaved. They shouldn't be playing video games. Plugged in, I've seen that before. Oh, that guy's plugged in, he's playing a video game during church. That kid is too. What's going on here? Who are the parents? Come on, we can do better than this. Or they're just out in the hall, just running around like crazy. Like, it is church. I think they can get some of this. Come on, if they go even to kindergarten, they got to sit still. They got to listen to the teacher. They're there a good portion of the day. They can do it. They can do it here too. The other adults, sometimes I go, man, that guy sleeps every time I speak. And he's always sleeping. Like, why are you sleeping, dude? Like, sundown was 7. Well, here it was, what, 5, whatever. You know, a lot of time to sleep. Why are you sleeping every time you come to church? Like, you're here to learn. You're here to listen. We can do better. If we can do better, let's do better. Now, some people have a sleep problem, and I get that. At least you're here. That's understandable. We're not here to judge and be picky, but if we can do better, we need to do better. And if we're up partying till 3 in the morning and we can't stay awake, maybe we need to rethink our behavior and go, look, you know, I need to be able to pay attention here. And same thing would apply to the feast. You know, people just trash because they're up till 3 in the morning. Hey, if you're up till 3, you got to suck it up and stay awake. You just do it. But again, God's watching. It's all important. You know, when we worked at the auditorium and somebody was performing, anybody on the planet is performing on that stage, nobody is walking in or out during that performance. The only ones that ever moved was somebody who had to vomit and ran up the aisle, or something bad was happening. They took off, you know, during the performance out in the lobby and to the restroom. But if you're an usher, you don't allow anybody in until the performance, that song ends. And between the next song, open the doors, they'll get in, get to your seats. We paid attention. Like, that's the way it's done. At church, it's chaos sometimes. It's special music, and half the people are walking in and half the people are walking out. It shouldn't happen. It's a performance. They're singing a praise to God. Let's respect that. Have a seat. When it's over, get up. Or if you're out there, when they're done, now come in and get your seat. Stand in the back, just wait. And come on in. These kind of protocols have gotten lost. Mr. Howie's big on that. You know, we shouldn't, doing special music, you don't ever do it behind a lectern, right? That's off to the side. The music's over there. That's professionally done. I think we can do better in some areas, and that's what we're trying to do. And if I don't say it and nobody says it, we don't fix it. So I'm saying it to everybody. Let's do better, and let's do a good job with our kids. And help them learn about God and his way of life. And if they're big enough, they should pay attention and take notes. It's good for them. We have, in the years I've been in the church, sometimes got kicked out of halls because the kids were just running around in the hallways. Teenagers broke stuff. You know, it was so unruly, we've lost halls because of it. I have to say this about you and others. We were at the feast this year down in Daytona, and they just want us back. They were like, you guys are different than all the other groups. I mean, the staff there was extremely complimentary of our people. And even on the night, we waited till sundown and we broke everything down. I said, just give us an hour, we'll be out of there by 8. And she told me afterwards, she goes, I knew you had good intention. There's no way that was happening in an hour. And she said, when I showed up, you know, 50 minutes after sundown and it was done, I'm blown away. Like, no group ever does that. And you guys even picked up the trash. I'm like, well, yeah, we want to leave it nice. You know, the impression that our people gave there was the way God wants it to be, a real light to the community. And people were pleasant to the greeters, their greeters, which they had to have, I guess, and I had to pay for. But people were kind and they were pleasant. They said hello and they got to talking with them. Several of them, when we were cleaning up the last night, came over and said, boy, we hope you come back. Your people are awesome. It's the most friendly group I've ever seen. Let's do that in every little church area, everywhere, here, there, and everywhere, because that was what God really is pleased with. Again, we are in the presence of God. This is a holy convocation, and the way we behave and the things we do matter to God. We could talk about many other things, but I think we've talked about a lot of the important aspects of the Sabbath and what God would want us to do or not to do on the Sabbath. These are general guiding principles. You know, I'll give you an example. When we were kids, one of the things that we did quite often, and not in the winter because it's Saskatchewan, but we would go to the park on a Friday night or on a Sabbath after church and just like walk through the park. Beautiful flowers. You know, I remember when we were little, we get to bring our butterfly nets and catch butterflies or bees and other things. Like is God's nature. It was beautiful. This is what the millennium is going to be like. This is a beautiful park. And we go for a walk, take the dogs, go for a walk for a couple miles and enjoy nature. That makes the Sabbath fun for kids. Again, the good meals, making it special. I remember when we were even little, we got wine on Friday night. Now, it was a thimbleful, and it was in this little tiny glass, but, this is a special occasion. You can all have a little wine. It's like Passover, right? It's that much. But we all got, when we were little, like that was so cool, like we're having wine. And when we came in the church, it was like Cold Duck or Mogan David. Like, it was the cheapest wine known to the planet. We didn't have money, but that was still pretty special. And I still remember it, to this day. The Sabbath was a delight. The Sabbath was wonderful. The holy days were also like that. We always put extra time into preparing for the upcoming holy days and making them special. And we grew up in the church and loved it. And other people that did that called those holy days a delight. I know people already are thinking about night to be observed. What are we going to do? And people decorate, people make special things. I know God is pleased when we do that. And it's about rejoicing. It's about feasting. It's about, man, I can't wait till these things actually, the things that we're doing now, the holy days, actually come to fruition. And God's plan moves on and we get to that millennium stage and beyond. We're close. We're right there. So the Sabbath is, again, a day when we can spend extra time in prayer, study, meditation. We should play, if we're playing music, good Sabbath music. One of the things that we do at our house yet today, and we were over to Molly and Casey's, they have this big screen TV, and it's got like cool nature scenes that move along and music to it, and it's like, man, that's a nice backdrop. The music's on, candles are lit, everything looks great. That just makes for special moments for the family. Back when we grew up in the church had music from Young Ambassadors, and before that it was the New World Singers, and back then it was cassette tapes, right? Like that was the cool thing. But Dad would put that kind of music in on a Friday night in the background, and we got a nice dinner, and we got to relax, and everybody got to bed early, unless we had company, and then we stayed up late talking. Because we couldn't wait to spend time with them. But the Sabbaths were true delights, and we need to continue to do that, and hopefully we all are even yet today. The Sabbath is unlike any other day of the week. Again, it is holy time. Every minute of the Sabbath is holy. You can't break it for 3 minutes coming in or 3 minutes going out. Every minute is holy time. Don't infringe on the Sabbath on either end. It's coming. I see it's coming. I got to shut this down. It is holy time. God made it that way. It's time that God set apart for a very special and wonderful purpose for us. It's made for man. It's made for our benefit. And how you observe the Sabbath determines, number one, how well you please God, and number two, on how much you are able to rejoice in this special day of the week.
For more information, go to our website at cogassembly.org. Copyright 2023, Church of God Assembly. All rights reserved.